As you can see, the sanctuary is empty. No one is here, which makes this a perfect place to preach because there is no one here to critique the sermon. But of course, we know that will not be the case on Sunday morning and or Wednesday night. So the question becomes, when people fill the place, how do we preach sermons that are relevant, but most importantly, how do we preach sermons that are relatable to those who fill the pews? Well, we understand that preaching and exegesis go hand in hand. You cannot be a responsible preacher unless, of course, you understand how to exegete the biblical text. I remember when I was a student learning biblical exegesis from Dr. Mitzi Minor, I remember her stressing that accurate exegesis required reading a passage in several contexts, including the immediate literary context, the context of the entire biblical book, the context of early Christian experience and thought, the context of Greco-Roman culture, the context of Jewish culture and history, and the context of Scripture as a whole. She called it the world behind the text, the world of the text, and the world in front of the text. But for our purposes, the question we want to raise is, what about the ones who hear the sermon that has been birthed out of biblical exegesis? Effective, responsible preaching requires that we be able to exegete the congregational context within which preaching takes place. In this particular module, we want to begin to deal with some approaches and some ideas as it pertains to congregational exegesis. Unfortunately, many preachers erroneously assume that knowledge of the congregation will be picked up through a combination of time and tenure, along with a healthy dose of intuition and or osmosis. If you're such a one, let me be the first to warn you, that does not work. Certainly, you'll learn some things about the congregation over time, but just like exegeting the biblical text is a skill to be learned, so is exegeting a congregation. Again, the focus of this particular module is exegeting congregations for preaching, or what I want to call learning how to look. That is to say, we want to consider when we exegete the congregation, when we consider those who are here, we want to raise two questions. Number one, what are we looking at? And number two, what are we looking for? And how does that impact what it is that we subsequently preach on Sunday morning? If you think about it, we are constantly looking at things for the purpose of gaining insight, exploring some assumptions, coming to some conclusions, offering some opinions, and the list goes on and on. In her book, Preaching as Local Theology and Folk Art, Lenora Turf Tisdale has suggested that we should prepare preachers and pastors not only to exegete biblical texts, but also to exegete congregations so that ministers can preach in ways that are both fitting and transformative for local faith communities. One of your assigned readings from this particular book is going to be 7 Symbols for Congregational Exegesis. In that reading, you will further explore ways in which this is done. Before we begin to deal with any specifics about exegeting the congregation, let's consider some things that Tisdale points out that we have already learned from congregations. Number one, the first thing she suggested we learn as it relates to preaching is, it's about God. Congregations remind us, if we listen, that worship is about God. Sometimes we preachers tend to forget that and we think it's all about us. We make jokes at the holiest moments in service because we ourselves are uneasy with the mystery. We work hard to find a novel idea in a biblical text without asking ourselves, but is there any good news here? We pride ourselves in a well-crafted turn of a phrase or story we tell without asking the deeper question, but did the sermon bring people into the presence of God? Yet, congregations consistently remind us by their presence, their faithfulness, and their hopeful faces that ultimately preaching is about God. The second thing that we learn from congregations about preaching is that just a little dab will do. I remember when I was a kid growing up, there was a product called Brill Cream. It was a hair pomade for men, and their little jingle and their little slogan was, just a little dab will do. What they were saying was it did not take the entire jar to get the job done. I think one of the mistakes that we make sometime in our preaching As we try to give the congregation the whole jar or the whole Bible, the extensive results of our exegetical research, the multiple meanings that certain words could potentially have in the Greek, and all three sermon possibilities that are present in the text. Well, the good news is congregations are present. They will sort of sit through it as we try to figure it out. But one of the things that we need to understand is we cannot preach it all. We have to begin to narrow that pericope. Number 3, we need to preach more about jobs and vocations. What does that have to do with preaching? Well, we have to keep in mind that the congregation to whom we're preaching has lives outside of the sanctuary. That is to say, they're engaged in any number of activities to include their jobs, their vocation, what they do for a living. So from time to time in our preaching, we need to address those things. Number 4, preaching depends on pastoral care for survival. In my own ministry, I've discovered that my preaching is informed by the care that I share with the congregation. It is in those moments that I learn who they are, what they respond to, what's important to them, and that certainly informs my preaching. Now, you have to be careful. You can't disclose all that you learn in those pastoral care moments, but it certainly proves helpful in your preaching. Number 5. The sermon is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. Listen, as a kid, having been raised in the church, I have a tremendously high opinion of preaching as the Word of God. It is not just mere mortals talking about what we think about God, but I sincerely believe that with the stirring of the Spirit, it becomes God's own words to God's own people. Now, one of the plus sides of having such a high view of preaching is that we never take the task lightly, and we're never careless about our preaching. We are about God's work. Therefore, we have to offer our very best. The best of our intellect, the best of our creativity, the best of our study. We're on holy ground when we preach the mysteries of God's word. However, there may be a downside to that theological viewpoint, and that is, if we're not careful, we can begin to think that our words and God's words are one and the same, but that could not be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, the congregation reminds us of this when they begin to raise questions about the sermon, or when they begin to simply show their displeasure with what we have preached. Now, one of the things that I want to suggest is that we're on the dawn of new ways of envisioning congregations, whether we're talking about house churches or emergent churches or the recovery of testimony in worship. The reality is the task of proclaiming the gospel and interpreting scripture has been entrusted to the whole community of faith and not just the preacher. Number 6. Preaching changes lives, and preaching is here to stay. Many of you all will remember from your first night of class that you were encouraged to remember and share a particular sermon that had impacted your life or influenced your life in meaningful ways. And each of you participated in that. Well, guess what? Sermons are still being preached. Some of the sermons that you're going to preach are going to impact people in meaningful ways. Because when you come right down to it, there is no substitute for one person talking to another person about the goodness of God. Now, as we begin to move into more specifics about congregational exegesis, I think one of the first things that we need to keep in mind is we need to consider the variety of persons to whom we preach. Even if you preach to the exact same group of people every single week, you would do well to give some intentional time to thinking about some of the information and insights that you've gleaned from them and how that impacts the particular text you will be preaching from. This will be tremendously helpful as we begin to think about what type of explanations, proofs, examples, or illustrations that will be helpful in communicating what it is we're trying to communicate from the biblical text. Now, I recognize that you cannot plan each part of your sermon perfectly to communicate to every person in your congregation. However, you ought to begin to think about at least some of the categories of persons that are in your congregation as you think about how it is you're going to effectively preach and what's the best way to tailor that message to them. Now, to help you develop this particular skill, I have drawn from a list that I discovered on Preaching Today. Now, while it is not considered to be an exhaustive list, I think it's an example of how we can think intentionally about who is in the congregation. Now, I will admit, it's a bit corny, but I think you'll get the idea. In every congregation, there are what we want to refer to as the cynics. Those are the individuals in the congregation who are skeptical. They've been burned by the church, or they've been disheartened by Christians. They're in some way disappointed or disillusioned with God and frustrated at some levels with the church. These persons will likely be sitting in the pews with their arms crossed, if not literally thinking, how much of this must I endure? They are distrusting of preachers, and those persons will need to be won over. Secondly, there is what he referred to as the overwhelmed. Every congregation has a growing number of these persons who are overwhelmed. Even if our grandparents would roll their eyes and think to themselves, overwhelmed, you have it easy compared to the kind of life I had. The reality is they may be in the throes of some serious challenges or some serious trials, and they need to hear something in the sermon that will encourage them in their walk with God. Then there are the new Christians. New Christians are always in the congregation. We love preaching to them, but we have to remember, everything is new to them. They don't always know our terms. They know very few Bible stories, if any at all. They know nothing at all about biblical history and so forth. So make sure some things in the sermon are carefully explained to them. Then, of course, there are the grieving. It has been said, if you preach to the hurting, you will always have an audience. And surely there are going to be some grieving persons who are going to be listening to your next sermon. And while every point cannot be directed at easing their pain, we should always be on the lookout for them. Remember, grieving is bigger than just mourning the loss of a loved one. Consider lost jobs, lost homes, lost loves, lost hopes, and lost relationships. Then there are the eager. These are they who are excited about everything that they hear. They are a huge blessing to the church, but keep in mind that a poorly worded section of the sermon can be used as a club by the eager to beat on other segments of the congregation. So we want to be mindful of that. Then, of course, there is the apathetic. They're just sort of there. They don't want to do anything. They don't want to be bothered. So we have to be intentional in our preaching to find ways to motivate them. Now, that's kind of general, but that helps us to understand what I mean. We have to think specifically about who's in the congregation. Now, I don't want this particular module to be too long, but I do want to mention that there are some specific ways to analyze or exegete the congregation. You can consider the programs, you can consider the congregational processes, and of course the social context. But for our purposes, I want to talk about how do we analyze congregational symbols. Now, here's the good thing about that. This does not require us to learn an entirely new set of skills. In the normal course of ministry, we're already beginning to describe the congregations in certain ways and place them in certain subsets. So this is not about so much learning a new way to look as much as it is developing a new way of perceiving that which we already see. So how do we determine what symbols we're going to look at? Number one, we want to seek out symbols that have meaning to the congregation. Which symbols in the congregation receive the most attention? What traditions cannot be changed? Which stories are repeated with the most frequency? At this point, listening will be your most valuable asset. Number two, you want to investigate the symbols in various forms. This can range from a favorite hymn or a particular painting or picture that hangs in the church. We do not want to just look at certain symbols, but we want to think broadly about symbols, though both verbal and nonverbal. Number three, don't become overly concerned about contradictions in the symbols. Therefore, think it not strange if the congregation has multiple identities, some of which they're not even aware of. Now, that's relatively quick. What I want you to do now is I want you to look at the assigned reading and begin to further explore ways in which you can analyze the congregation. In our next module, we will begin to look at how do we exegete cultural context.